Chapter 211. First title. Just like that, the tournament continued, the days slipping by in a blur of cheers, strikes, and fierce clashes of steel. Lucavian watched, keenly attuned to the rhythm of each match, his own and Valeria's, as their respective paths wove through the week's endless surge of contenders. His third opponent had been a swordsman, an early 3-star. The man held his ground well, skilled in blade techniques meant to parry and counter, but Lucavian had dispatched him with minimal effort, relying more on speed and precision than strength. The bout was over in moments, his opponent unable to keep up with Lucavian's swift footwork and confident, almost mocking, ease. Lucavian left the arena that time with hardly a drop of sweat. His amusement barely contained as he flashed the crowd his signature smirk on his way out. For Valeria, though her third opponent had been a step up, a mid-3-star fighter, wielding a heavy axe and an even heavier aura. Lucavian noted her cautious stance, every move deliberately controlled as she faced him. The axe wielder was unrelenting, his strikes coming down in massive arcs that shook the ground with each miss. But Valeria held her ground, her form graceful and precise, meeting each of his strikes with a calculated maneuver that kept her just a breath out of reach. By the end, as she delivered the final, decisive blow, Lucavian could see her confidence had grown, her tension melting as she adapted to the rhythm of the match. And between the matches, the two continued spending time together. Lucavian himself had changed the inn that he was staying in and started staying in the same inn that Valeria was staying. At the start, Valeria did not like that fact and felt like he was being clingy. Or at least, that was how she had shown outside, though inwardly she had already gotten accustomed, maybe even becoming overly familiar with his presence. And then, his fourth opponent came. A mid-3-star from a reputed adventurer party. Took the field. Lucavian's smirk widened. The fighter, more accomplished and visibly cautious, took his time with each move, assessing Lucavian's casual stance and underestimating his intent. The duel stretched longer than Lucavian expected, but he enjoyed it, enjoying the thrill of each blocked strike, each feint that led his opponent into another trap. When he finally bested him, the crowd erupted, some clearly surprised by how swiftly he'd handled someone of such rank. On the other hand, Valeria's fourth match, however, was more challenging. Her opponent, an early 3-star, looked to be an easy victory at first, but she quickly realized that his cultivation level belied a mastery of technique that was uncommonly sharp. Her swordsmanship was fluid and unpredictable, shifting patterns in mid-strike with a swiftness that tested her ability to anticipate. She blocked and dodged, moving with increased speed, but her opponent's strikes only seemed to grow more complex, weaving attacks that forced her into the defensive. Lucavian, watching from the stands, saw the frustration simmer beneath her otherwise steady movements. She was learning, each deflected blow adding to her rhythm, adjusting to his unpredictable style as she found openings she hadn't noticed before. Eventually, with a decisive parry and a pivot, she brought her sword down in a single, clear strike that ended the fight. She'd won, but he could see she wasn't satisfied with herself. Her lips pressed into a thin line as she left the field. The crowds had begun to dissipate as evening draped itself over the city, casting warm light across cobbled streets and the faint glow of lanterns flickering in shop windows. Lucavian walked beside Valeria, his usual lightheartedness barely concealed behind a curious glance her way every few steps. She, however, was quiet, her gaze fixed forward, her lips pressed into that familiar tight line he'd noticed after her match. As they left the arena together, Lucavian walked beside Valeria with an easy stride, glancing at her tense expression, lips pressed in the same way they'd been since her fourth match ended. The sunset bathed the city in a golden glow, but it did little to soften the determined set of her jaw, her gaze fixed forward. After a few beats of silence, he leaned closer, his voice light with a teasing edge. Now, Valeria, don't tell me you're sulking over today's match. You really did put on quite a show. His eyes sparkled with amusement, but there was a hint of genuine admiration beneath it. Valeria shot him a sideways glance, her eyes narrowing just slightly. I'm not sulking, she muttered, though her tone betrayed the edge of irritation. I just could have handled that differently. Could have. Lucavian raised an eyebrow, the corner of his mouth tugging upward. You practically danced around that guy. Had him right where you wanted, didn't you? She looked ahead, her expression not softening. He was sharper than I expected, that's all. His skill caught me off guard, which shouldn't have happened. Lucavian couldn't help the small laugh that escaped him. Valeria, that's called adapting. You adjusted, found an opening, and won. Don't beat yourself up just because it wasn't perfect. Valeria's lips pressed even tighter, but she didn't answer right away. There was something in his words that struck at her usual armor. The silence stretched between them as they wove through the bustling streets, the city alive with the energy of the tournament's ongoing thrill. They walked on in silence, Valeria's thoughts churning beneath her composed exterior. Though she tried to shrug off his praise, the truth of it made her uneasy. Watching Lucavian in his matches over the past days had unsettled her in ways she hadn't expected. His effortless precision, his unfazed smirk as he dismantled his opponents with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. It was a reminder, again and again, of the gap between them. And that, she thought bitterly, was why she was not happy. After a beat, she glanced at him out of the corner of her eye, noting the relaxed set of his shoulders and the casual way he seemed to move through the world. He walked as if every street, every shadow, and every opponent he faced was just another piece of his playground. Sigh, like, why am I even competing with this guy? When she asked this question to herself, she could find the answer. She just wanted to beat him, be better than him, to not look down on him, but she just saw him as a rival. Was there supposed to be a reason for that? She did not know, though Lucavian alone was not the case. The disciples of the well-known sects and some others also caught her attention quite much. They were all strong, and she was slightly feeling anxious at this point, feeling like she could lose a fight at any moment and she would lose this chance to prove herself and her name. As they continued down the bustling streets, the city's evening glow cast a warm hue over the crowd filtering around them. The murmurs grew, faint at first, just threads of conversation weaving through the noise, until a few words caught their ears. Did you see the Pink Knight today? That last match. She was incredible. They say she's the Olarian heir, from the noble family. Yeah, Valeria Olarian. It's not just her looks with that pink hair. She has skill, too. She's got a reputation to uphold, after all. Valeria's shoulders tensed slightly, her jaw set as she kept her eyes fixed ahead. Yet it was clear the talk hadn't escaped her. Lucavian, catching her change in posture, smirked, his own attention drifting as he caught snippets about himself. Heard about him too, the one from Rakenshore, right? Took out those bandits single-handedly, or so they say. Bit too smug if you ask me, but that man fights like a shadow. No wasted movements, no mercy. Yeah, they've started calling him the Phantom Blade. All finesse, no hesitation. It's like he's barely putting in effort. The corner of Lucavian's mouth curved up as he absorbed the new moniker, clearly amused. Yet he kept his attention on Valeria, who seemed to ignore the whispers about herself. He leaned a bit closer, lowering his voice, his tone as teasing as ever. So, the Pink Knight, huh? He raised an eyebrow, a smirk dancing on his lips. Quite the title. Seems you've made quite the impression. A faint smile tugged at the corners of Valeria's lips despite herself. She'd been waiting for this, hadn't she? Recognition. She was no stranger to expectations, but hearing her name pass through the mouths of strangers, seeing the respect gleam in their eyes as they spoke of her skill, it was a different feeling entirely. She'd finally begun to make a name for herself, one she was building with her own two hands. But alongside that warmth, an unmistakable weight settled on her shoulders. The mention of her family name brought with it a heavy reminder. Now, her every step in this tournament would carry the legacy of the Olarian family. She couldn't afford missteps or near victories. Each win had to be decisive, unmistakable. Anything less would cast doubt, not only on her but on her family's reputation. She glanced over at Lucavian, catching his smirk. The Pink Knight, she murmured, almost to herself. It does have a certain ring to it, doesn't it? Lucavian's eyes sparkled with mischief. I'd say it suits you quite well. though Olarian's air certainly adds a nice layer of weight, wouldn't you say? Valeria's lips pressed together, the hint of a smile faltering. Yes, I'm sure that's the part people will be most interested in. Valeria Olarian, heir to the Olarian family, the duty-bound knight who simply must live up to the family's prestige. Her voice held an edge of dry humor, though her shoulders had tightened once more. Lucavian shrugged, unconcerned. And what's wrong with that? Isn't that why you're here in the first place? To make sure everyone knows you're more than just a name. She sighed softly, letting his words sink in. True, since she could not refute it. Creak. Just like that, they entered the same in that they had been eating in for the past few days. The tavern belonging to Iron Matron. Chapter 212. Lucavian, come with us. As they stepped inside, the familiar creak of the Iron Matron's heavy wooden door swung shut behind them. The warm, cozy hum of the inn embraced them, the smell of roasted meats and herbs mingling with the low murmur of voices from other patrons. Valeria glanced around, instinctively scouting for an ideal seat and, spotting one by the fire, made her way to the left side of the inn. Meanwhile, Lucavian drifted toward a different corner on the right, drawn to the quiet and slightly secluded booth by the window. Perfect spot. This place seems fine, they both muttered under their breath, their voices overlapping as they looked at each other, realizing their divided choices. Lucavian's lips twitched with amusement, but instead of speaking, he turned and crossed over to where Valeria stood. He gave her a small nod, then sat down at the table she'd chosen, placing his arms leisurely on the table, watching her with that faintly knowing smirk. Valeria, after a brief hesitation, took the seat across from him, her gaze shifting between the spot she'd originally noticed by the fire and the table they now occupied. Second thoughts, Lucavian murmured, eyeing her expression as if reading her thoughts. Valeria straightened her posture, waving off his comment with a flick of her hand. I made my choice, she said, lifting her chin, though her gaze darted again, almost unconsciously, to the warmer spot she had reluctantly given up. Ah, but I don't think you're entirely satisfied with it, Lucavian observed with a grin, stretching one arm casually over the back of the chair. We could always sit there instead. No, she replied, perhaps a bit too quickly. I'm fine here. This spot is just as good as any other. Lucavian chuckled, his eyes twinkling with amusement. Well, I can't have you sitting there, pouting over a better choice. Come on, follow me. He stood, gesturing with a lazy sweep of his arm toward the fireside table. Valeria opened her mouth to protest, but the faint smirk on his lips said he'd already won. Huffing softly, she rose and strode to the fireside table, determined to sit without a hint of hesitation, though the faintest hint of color rose to her cheeks. Once settled, Valeria felt the warmth of the fire settle around her, and she glanced over at Lucavian with a glint of appreciation, though her expression remained composed. Happy now? She asked, arching an eyebrow. Lucavian's grin only grew. Very. On the other hand, as Lucavian and Valeria settled by the fireside table, a familiar figure approached them, Jorkin, a stout man with a calm, dependable demeanor and a knack for remembering patrons' preferences. He was one of the more seasoned workers at the Iron Matron and had already marked both Lucavian and Valeria as distinguished guests, owing to their frequent visits and, more importantly, the Iron Matron's unofficial endorsement to treat them well. Well, Jorkin greeted them, his voice a low rumble as he stopped beside their table. I see our favorite fighters have found the best seat in the house tonight. He cast a quick glance between them, his eyes twinkling with a kind of knowing amusement. Valeria nodded curtly. She was still not comfortable with the hospitality that they were receiving, since she couldn't quite understand the reason. It all happened even before when her name was spread, as when she followed Lucavian here, suddenly the treatment was different. She asked him what this was about, but she didn't get an answer as usual. Lucavian leaned back, his usual grin playing at the corners of his mouth. Ah, Mr. Jorkin, you make it sound as if we're royalty, he drawled, glancing over at Valeria. Or perhaps you're just thrilled we're keeping your inn in business with our fighting spirit, eh? Jorkin chuckled, unfazed by Lucavian's teasing. Well, you indeed bring a certain light to this place. But mate, you seem to get yourself a new alias. Phantom Blade? Lucavian's grin widened as he leaned back, clearly enjoying Jorkin's comment. Ah, the Phantom Blade, is it? Seems I'm collecting titles these days, he remarked, a spark of amusement in his eyes. Though you know how these things go. Titles come and go as fast as the next fight. Valeria's gaze flicked to him, arching an eyebrow. Dramatic, she murmured, her tone laced with an edge of skepticism. Lucavian shrugged, entirely unbothered. Dramatic, maybe, but it keeps things interesting. People love a mystery, after all. And if it gives them something to talk about while they sip their ale, who am I to disappoint? He shot her a sidelong glance, clearly anticipating some jab from her. Valeria didn't disappoint. Interesting how you talk about titles, as if they're little favors you're granting the public, she replied, a faint smirk tugging at her lips. Maybe you're just enjoying it more than you let on. Now, I'd hardly call it enjoying, he drawled, though the amusement never left his face. More like adapting. I find it practical to let people's imaginations do the work for me. Easier that way. She shook her head slightly, unable to hide the faintest smile as she leaned back. Adapt all you want, Lucavian, but you'd better be ready to live up to this phantom business. Why should I? If I don't live up to that name, people will find a new one for me. Eventually, I will get a title that will be fitting for me. Humph, you have an answer for everything. I tend to think a lot to myself. Seeing the two talking to each other, Jorkin just sighed and returned with their orders, setting down the steaming bowls of venison stew along with Lucavian's ale and Valeria's water. Enjoy your meal, Phantom Blade, he quipped with a grin, clearly amused at the moniker's growing popularity. Valeria's gaze tightened, her hand instinctively drifting toward the hilt of her sword as she watched the approaching figures. The Cloud Heaven's sect disciples moved with a calculated poise, their gazes steady as they cut through the bustle of the inn. They hadn't approached her since the last incident, but their presence now seemed anything but casual. Her jaw set, ready for whatever confrontation they might bring. Across the table, Lucavian remained unruffled, casually lifting his ale to his lips as if completely oblivious to the tension thickening in the air. But Valeria knew better. His relaxed demeanor was a facade. His eyes held a faint glimmer, taking in the group with a calm sharpness that belied his outward ease. The lead disciple stopped just a few paces from their table, bowing with a shallow respect that felt almost perfunctory. But contrary to what she had expected, this time their words were different. You Lucavian, come with us, we need to talk. This time their target was Lucavian. Over the past few days, the disciples of the Cloud Heaven sect had been closely observing Lucavian, their eyes trained on his every move. Initially, their interest had been sparked by his unexpected interruption during their first encounter with Valeria, a disruption they had dismissed as little more than arrogance from an upstart. But as the tournament continued, and as word of Lucavian's prowess spread through the city, their perceptions began to shift. What they had brushed off as bravado was now revealing itself as something else entirely: skill, precision, and an unsettling ease that only deepened their wariness. At first, they'd tried subtle ways to undermine him. Knowing Lucavian's next opponents, they had discreetly arranged for those challengers to receive high-quality weapons, each imbued with mana to give them an edge. But despite their careful meddling, Lucavian had dismissed his opponents with effortless precision, not once allowing them to push him past a few calculated moves. Their tactics, which had worked countless times before, had failed against him, fueling both frustration and unease among the disciples. Each victory he secured in the arena only solidified his reputation, whispers of his Phantom Blade moniker filling the city's taverns and streets. It was only after a few particularly swift victories that they began to recognize the true threat Lucavian posed. His opponents left the arena visibly shaken, muttering of an almost supernatural finesse, of how he seemed to predict their moves before they even struck. Lucavian's skill was becoming more than a rumor. It was proving a barrier between them and their intentions. The Cloud Heaven's sect disciples, each accustomed to power and respect, found themselves grappling with a growing sense of inadequacy as they watched him dominate the tournament. And the final blow to their patience came when the tournament's top 32 competitors were announced. Their sect had only 6 disciples left in the tournament, which was not bad considering its scale, as more than 500 people were rumored to have joined. It was normal for each of their sect's 6 disciples who had advanced would face off against a formidable opponent. But for one disciple, the name they'd drawn was what brought them here at that moment. Lucavian. And that was why now they were facing them here. Zira, who had been somehow the person who was in charge of matters regarding him, now stood here. You, Lucavian, come with us. We need to talk. And she ordered. Chapter 213. But, as the sound echoed in the room, Valeria was surprised. They didn't come for me? She asked herself. It was really something that she had never expected. You, Lucavian, come with us. We need to talk. Lucavian's smile was easy, almost lazy, as he looked up at Zira, who stood before him with a barely veiled arrogance in her gaze. Her posture was rigid, and there was a flash of impatience in her eyes as she waited for him to respond. Why should I? He replied, his tone casual as he leaned back in his seat, the glint of mischief never leaving his eyes. He made no move to stand, simply watching her with an amused tilt of his head. I don't even know you. Zira's lips tightened, her composure wavering at his blatant disregard. This isn't a request, she said sharply, her tone laced with a simmering edge. You've crossed enough lines already, and our sect would appreciate some answers. Lucavian chuckled, raising his eyebrows. Lines? What lines have I crossed? And answers? About what? I thought the tournament was a place for fighting, not questioning one's motives. His tone remained light, but his gaze sharpened slightly as he continued. Or is there something about my victories that bothers you? Valeria observed the exchange in silence, her hand resting loosely on the table but her expression as hard as steel. She hadn't expected this confrontation to shift so suddenly onto Lucavian, and the fact that Zira now seemed focused on him sent a chill down her spine. Zira's fists clenched at her sides, a spark of anger flaring in her gaze as she met Lucavian's mocking expression. Every part of her wanted to draw her sword, to show him the price of his arrogance. But she restrained herself, reminding herself of the delicate situation. Causing a scene here, under the watchful eyes of the Iron Matrons Inn, would bring trouble none of them needed. Worse, they lacked a valid reason for confrontation. Her personal irritation wasn't nearly enough to justify a public fight. Swallowing her pride, she forced a small, composed smile onto her face, the kind that barely reached her eyes. I assure you, Lucavian, it is not about your victories, she said, her voice softening to an almost diplomatic tone. We only wish to talk. It would be easier for everyone if you'd simply come with us. Lucavian tilted his head, his smirk widening as he observed the barely concealed tension in her posture. Talk, is it? Funny, you don't seem like the talking type, he replied lightly, his voice dripping with amusement. But let's pretend I'm interested. What is it that the Great Cloud Heavens sect wants with a nobody like me? Zira's smile tightened. I think you know very well why we're interested, she said, keeping her tone even. That is why you must also know that this is not a place to talk about it. Lucavian's eyes flickered with a knowing glint as he looked up at Zira, a slight tilt to his head. Of course, he understood exactly why she was here, but there was no reason to make this easy for her. Not yet, at least. Ah, so they finally get to act. He mused inwardly, enjoying the irony. They'd made sure his opponents were equipped with advanced weapons, pushing him harder than most fighters. And yet, each attempt had only added to his reputation rather than diminished it. I guess I am finally against one of them? He did not have any access to the information about his opponents beforehand, at least not the moment that his opponents were determined. Sex had such privileges, and it was fine for him, as this was the real world and connections indeed mattered. Though on the other side, Valeria's eyes darted between them, her posture tense. She couldn't decipher the undercurrent between the two, a silent exchange that seemed to carry years of enmity in mere glances. What are they talking about? What reason could Lucavian possibly have for drawing their attention like this? She narrowed her gaze, trying to read between their words. Lucavian leaned back even further, folding his arms across his chest. "And here I thought I was just another face in the crowd," he said, his tone light but calculated. "I didn't realize the Cloud Heavens sect took such an interest in nobodies." Zira's forced smile didn't falter, though her eyes held a hard, dangerous glint. "Oh, rest assured, you're far from nobody anymore. Word of your accomplishments spreads fast in a city like this. So, Lucavian," she continued, her voice lowering just enough that only those at the table could hear, "if you want to keep certain details hidden, I suggest you come with us." Accomplishments? Valeria thought, her confusion deepening. The Cloud Heavens sect had always acted with a kind of restrained pride, rarely concerning themselves with any competitors outside of their immediate goals. Yet now here they were, seemingly rattled by Lucavian's victories. "Oh, I see," Lucavian replied, feigning understanding, his voice dripping with false innocence. "I imagine that would be quite convenient for you, wouldn't it?" His gaze held hers steadily, challenging. "But maybe I prefer to stay right where I am. After all, it's not every day the Cloud Heavens sect makes such an effort for, well, a phantom." Zira's expression flickered for just a moment, revealing a flash of irritation. She took a step closer, lowering her voice to a near whisper. "This isn't a game, Lucavian. You do know, this will be your final offer." He chuckled softly, unfazed by the veiled threat, and raised an eyebrow. "Really? Let me hear the offer then." Zira scanned the room quickly, noting how the tension between them had drawn the attention of nearby patrons. People were starting to glance their way, their gazes flickering between Lucavian's lazy grin and her own composed, albeit strained, expression. Aware of the eyes upon them, she took a deep breath and swallowed her irritation, smoothing her expression into something softer, something that could pass as interest. Her smile shifted, the edges turning up in a calculated display of charm as she leaned in slightly, allowing a hint of warmth to creep into her gaze. She lowered herself gracefully into the chair beside him, one hand resting on the edge of the table as she looked up at him through half-lidded eyes. "Oh, Lucavian," she purred, her tone laced with a playful edge. "You do like to make things difficult, don't you?" She reached over, tapping a finger lightly on his arm as though they were close friends, or perhaps something more. "All this resistance. It only makes me more intrigued." Lucavian raised an eyebrow, his smirk widening as he observed her act. He didn't seem the least bit fazed by her sudden change in demeanor, leaning back in his chair with an amused glint in his eyes. "Is that so?" he murmured, his tone playful but measured. "Well, I certainly wouldn't want to disappoint the esteemed Cloud Heavens sect." Zira's smile tightened ever so slightly, but she kept her expression light, letting out a soft, almost flirty laugh as if they were sharing an inside joke. She glanced around the room again, subtly noting how many eyes were now watching them, her voice dropping into a low murmur that only Lucavian could hear. "Listen carefully," she said, her tone still deceptively sweet. "It doesn't matter what persona you want to project here. I'm only interested in making sure the upcoming match goes smoothly, with a favorable outcome for our side. Surely you're clever enough to understand what I'm asking." Lucavian's eyes sparkled with amusement, clearly entertained by her attempt at subtlety. He leaned in slightly, resting his chin on his hand as he matched her tone. "Oh, I understand perfectly," he replied, his voice low but laced with mock surprise. "But I'm afraid you'll have to be a little more specific. I wouldn't want to make any assumptions, after all." Her jaw tightened just slightly, but Zira maintained her flirty facade, her eyes narrowing as she met his gaze. "We'd like you to consider a graceful defeat. The Cloud Heavens sect doesn't forget favors, Lucavian. Think of the opportunities that could open up for someone like you." He chuckled, feigning thoughtfulness as he looked her over. "Tempting offer," he murmured, his smirk never faltering. Lucavian leaned back, his gaze drifting to the ceiling as if he were weighing Zira's offer with the gravest of considerations. After a beat, he glanced back at her, his tone thoughtful, though his smirk remained intact. "Well, let's think about this," he began, his voice laced with casual musing. "I'm a rogue awakened, without ties to any sect, guild, or party. Not exactly wise to take on a whole established sect on my own, especially one with the influence and resources of the Cloud Heavens sect." He paused, letting his words hang in the air. "So, in theory, aligning myself with you could save me a lot of unnecessary conflict." Zira's smile grew, a glint of satisfaction in her eyes as she nodded along. She had expected stubborn resistance from him, not this sudden show of practicality. Perhaps, she thought, this rogue has more sense than bravado after all. Lucavian continued, his tone almost conspiratorial. "And let's not ignore the perks you're hinting at. Favor with the Cloud Heavens sect, connections, maybe even some guidance with resources or cultivation techniques." He raised an eyebrow. "For a guy like me, it sounds like a path to a smoother, more manageable life. One without quite as many obstacles." Zira's amusement softened into something. Maybe this guy is not that bad? His pragmatic thinking, unexpected in someone who usually acted with such carefree arrogance, kinda looked cute. She caught herself admiring him for a moment, even finding him adorable in a way she hadn't anticipated. "Let's spend tomorrow's night with him." "Exactly," she murmured, imagining the tomorrow night. But then, a voice came into her ears. "But I refuse." Chapter 214, I refuse. "But I refuse." Zira's eyes widened, her mind barely processing what she just heard. "But I refuse." The words echoed in her ears, ringing with a finality that shattered the comfortable illusion she'd briefly allowed herself to entertain. She turned slowly to look at him, the lingering traces of her admiration replaced by sheer disbelief. Surely, this had to be a joke. Lucavian couldn't have been serious, not after everything he'd just said. Not after hinting that he understood the advantages, the opportunities she was offering. "What?" she managed, her voice caught between incredulity and shock. But as her gaze met him, all hope of him jesting vanished. His face held none of the light-hearted mischiefs he often wore. Instead, his expression was dead serious, his eyes gleaming with a cold amusement that bordered on cruelty. Lucavian tilted his head to the side, his one foot suddenly raised onto his seat. "One of the things I, Lucavian, love doing most is saying no right to the faces of those who think they have an absolute advantage." His face was menacing, his eyes were cold. "What?" He was dead serious, really saying that. Her jaw clenched, the warmth she'd felt just moments ago evaporating into a simmering resentment. "You," she stammered, struggling to keep her composure, her voice low but filled with venom. "So you were just toying with me?" He shrugged, utterly unbothered by the anger simmering in her eyes. "Bingo!" he echoed, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Lucavian's smirk only widened, his eyes glinting with a dark amusement that twisted the atmosphere into something razor-sharp. He leaned forward, his gaze never leaving Zira's, a mocking glint dancing in his expression as he spoke, voice low and dripping with disdain. "Oh, did you really think I'd make deals with people like you?" he asked, his words laced with cruelty. "I'm not interested in bending to the whims of two-faced schemers who parade their arrogance as if it's worth anything to me." He paused, letting his words sink in, each one sharpened with malice. "I've got standards, a little dignity, if you will, something you might want to consider yourself." Zira's face flushed, a mixture of humiliation and fury boiling beneath her calm facade. The lingering warmth she'd felt before was gone, replaced by a deep, simmering resentment. Her composure wavered, her hands clenching at her sides as she fought to maintain her expression. But the venom in her gaze was unmistakable. "So this is what you call dignity, then?" she hissed, her voice barely containing the resentment flooding through her. "Mocking people who have shown you respect?" Lucavian raised an eyebrow, the smirk never faltering. "Respect? Let's not kid ourselves here. This was never about respect," he replied coldly. "It was about leverage, influence, a trade-off, where you saw me as some tool to fit into your grand schemes. He chuckled darkly, leaning back as if to savor the bitterness in her gaze. But unfortunately for you, I'm not one of your lapdogs, and I never will be. For a brief moment, a silence stretched between them, taut and heavy, the tension simmering in the air. Zira's face hardened, her anger barely restrained. She knew that any outburst here would only give him satisfaction. But his words had left a mark, cutting through her usual resolve. Fine, she said, her voice like ice. Play your little game, Lucavian. But don't be surprised when this arrogance costs you dearly. He gave a mocking little bow, smirk still firmly in place. Can't wait to see you try, he replied smoothly, eyes flashing with taunting amusement. As she turned to leave, he added, loud enough for her to hear, and make sure to bring that so-called dignity with you. You'll need it. Zira didn't turn back, but the tension in her shoulders told him his words had struck deep. She disappeared into the crowd, leaving Lucavian to watch her retreat with a satisfied glint in his eye, wholly unbothered by the storm he'd just unleashed. As Zira and her disciples exited the inn, leaving a wake of whispered ire, Lucavian's mocking smirk lingered, practically daring anyone to challenge him further. The room's tense air gradually dissipated, and the patrons resumed their quiet, private conversations, retreating to their own lives. Across the table, Valeria watched Lucavian with a narrowed gaze, her earlier composure replaced by an unfamiliar agitation. She found herself holding onto memories of Zira's brief, intimate gestures toward Lucavian, like when she had boldly draped herself over him. Despite herself, Valeria's mind kept circling back to it, a stubborn irritation gnawing at her thoughts. Why is this bothering me so much? She wondered, her eyes flitting away from him as she tried to gather herself. It's not as if his choices should matter to me. Her attention shifted back to Lucavian as he leisurely adjusted his coat, his expression radiating pure satisfaction. He seemed entirely unfazed by the hostility he'd just incited, as if he thrived on the challenge. Unable to hold it in, Valeria spoke, her tone laced with restrained frustration. So, is humiliating others your way of fun? She half sneered, but the bite in her voice carried an undertone of genuine curiosity. This Lucavian, the one who seemed to relish in cruelty, was one she could hardly stand. He met her gaze, a trace of amusement flickering in his eyes. Only when they're foolish enough to try to pull one over on me, he replied, almost dismissively. She thought she had the upper hand. I simply reminded her otherwise. Valeria exhaled sharply, leaning back as she struggled to contain the discontent simmering beneath her calm facade. What kind of person derives joy from someone's embarrassment? She questioned internally. And then she remembered how he was before. Well, he is indeed like that. But as she observed the satisfaction in his smirk, another thought surfaced, unwelcome and unsettling. Did he actually enjoy her attention before all this? Valeria's jaw clenched subtly as the image of Zira wrapped around him flashed again in her mind. Unbidden, her irritation solidified, taking root like a splinter she couldn't ignore. Why does it even matter? She muttered under her breath, more to herself than to him. Lucavian caught her quiet words, his smirk widening. Troubling thoughts, Valeria? He asked, feigning innocence. Jealousy, perhaps? His gaze danced with a knowing mischief that only fueled her frustration further. Ha! Who is jealous of whom? The instant the words left her mouth, Lucavian's laughter erupted, loud and unrestrained. Ha 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 ha! His head tilted back before he doubled over, clutching his stomach, laughing as if he'd heard the most hilarious joke in the world. The sight of him bent over, nearly choking with amusement, only added to her simmering anger. Her cheeks burned, partly from embarrassment, though she wouldn't admit it, even to herself. You, she spluttered, fists clenched as her voice rose above the hum of the inn. Nearby patrons glanced over, some curious, others amused. But Lucavian didn't even seem to notice the looks. He laughed on, completely unabashed. Finally, she couldn't take it anymore. What exactly is so funny about any of this? She demanded, her tone sharp as steel. Her eyes locked onto him with barely contained frustration. Still chuckling, Lucavian straightened up, letting out a few final, breathless laughs before his gaze settled back on her. His expression a blend of exasperating amusement and genuine interest. "What was so funny?" he echoed, tilting his head mockingly, a glint of mischief in his eyes. "Your reaction, Valeria. What else?" Valeria's eyes were still narrowed, her frustration simmering. "And what's so funny about my reaction?" "Then?" she pressed, her voice sharp with barely veiled irritation. Lucavian shook his head, the last traces of his laughter fading into a smug smile. "It tells quite a lot of interesting things," he said, with a gleam in his eye that only deepened her irritation. Her expression turned skeptical, her voice tight. "What exactly does it tell?" "Oh, that's for you to figure out," he replied, waving off her question with infuriating casualness. Valeria's gaze narrowed further, piercing and skeptical. She opened her mouth, ready to fire back, but Lucavian leaned in, shifting the mood with a subtle but disarming ease. Resting his chin on his hand, his elbow on the table, he fixed her with a look that was both knowing and unexpectedly gentle. "But whatever you're worrying about," he began, his voice quieter, the smirk softening at the edges, "didn't happen. So you really don't need to worry." His eyes held hers for a beat, intent and unwavering. "Even if 100 women like her lined up, Valeria, I'd still choose dining with a beautiful knight who upholds her honor 100 times over." And that was something she couldn't answer. Chapter 215. What is this? "But whatever you're worrying about didn't happen. So you really don't need to worry. Even if 100 women like her lined up, Valeria, I'd still choose dining with a beautiful knight who upholds her honor 100 times over." The words hung in the air between them, Lucavian's gaze steady, his expression uncharacteristically sincere. For a brief moment, Valeria simply stared, the weight of his words lingering without fully sinking in. Her mind spun, looping around what he'd said, trying to make sense of it. 100 times over, he would choose. She began to piece it together slowly, the significance dawning in her thoughts like the first rays of sunlight cresting the horizon. And then it hit her. Her face flushed, the warmth spreading swiftly from her cheeks up to her ears, the shock rooting her to her seat. She couldn't hide the crimson spreading across her skin, and her hands instinctively clenched in her lap. But Lucavian's eyes held hers with a playful glint, watching as her expression shifted, completely aware of the effect his words were having. "You," she managed to stammer, feeling her voice waver against her will. She clenched her fists tighter, as if that might quell the rush of heat in her face, the feeling so foreign that she hardly knew how to respond. She scowled, but it lacked its usual force, undermined by the lingering blush. Lucavian's smirk returned, subtly triumphant. "Yes," he drawled, his tone light and maddeningly smug. Valeria opened her mouth to respond, but no words formed. Her throat tightened as if it refused to let anything out. She clenched her jaw, silently cursing herself for the lack of control. What was happening to her? The feeling inside her was like nothing she had ever encountered, burning yet fleeting, intense yet elusive. As a knight, she had spent her life training, striving, and carrying the weight of her family's honor on her shoulders. She had sparred against the deadly opponents and met the clash of cold steel without flinching. But now, this warmth, so unlike the chill of iron, left her unable to steady herself. This can't be real, she told herself, fighting against the foreign sensation flaring in her chest. It's not the thrill of battle or the cold discipline of duty. But if it wasn't that, then what was it? The warmth wasn't just from the fire beside them. It was in her very core, heat rising up and mingling with the maddening thrum of her heartbeat. And though she wanted to look away from him, her gaze was drawn back to Lucavian, as if he were the source of it all. What is this feeling? She wondered, frustration and confusion clashing. Her heart pounded in her chest, betraying her with every erratic beat. Why can't I just answer him now? She questioned herself, a gnawing frustration taking root alongside her confusion. She had never hesitated to face anything head-on and had always confronted challenges, no matter how daunting. But now, when the response should have been simple, her voice was gone. Her throat felt constricted, and she could barely breathe through the swirling, heated tension that sat heavily between them. What makes this different? She asked herself again, as if repeating the question might yield an answer. But nothing came. The answer was as elusive as the sensation growing in her chest. Lucavian's eyes remained fixed on her, pitch black and unwavering, his gaze carrying an intensity that felt almost suffocating. It weighed on her in ways she couldn't understand, making her pulse quicken and her resolve falter. For reasons she couldn't explain, she found herself looking away, her gaze drifting toward the fire rather than meeting those piercing eyes that watched her so closely. Why can't I meet his gaze? The question spun in her mind, pressing her with the kind of dread she had never felt in battle. She clenched her hands tightly, feeling the tension in her muscles, the vulnerability of being unable to confront him directly. Why is it so hard? But even that question gave no clarity, only compounding the strange, tightening sensation within her chest. A stifling tension she couldn't shake. Just when Valeria felt as though the overwhelming tension might finally push her over the edge, a clatter sounded beside her, and the aroma of freshly prepared food wafted through the air. She turned quickly, relief flooding her at the interruption, grateful for anything that might break the spell of this moment. But when she looked up to see who had brought their meal, her sense of reprieve vanished almost as quickly as it came. Standing beside their table, towering and formidable, was none other than the Iron Matron herself, her sharp gaze assessing as she set down their plates with an air of calm authority. Valeria's relief faltered. The Iron Matron's presence was always charged, and tonight was no different. The woman's silent power radiated as she placed the dishes before them, her eyes flicking between the two with a faint hint of amusement as if sensing the invisible tension crackling between them. "Your meals," the Iron Matron intoned, her voice low and carrying that measured weight that quieted everything around it. She looked pointedly at Valeria, her expression unreadable but distinctly knowing. "Thank you," Valeria managed, her voice steadier than she felt, though she kept her gaze firmly on the food in front of her rather than risking another glance in Lucavian's direction. The Iron Matron gave a brief, approving nod, then turned her gaze on Lucavian. "I trust this will be to your satisfaction as well. I never doubted your skills. I don't want to doubt yours too. But you really seem reckless. What can I do? I learned it from my master." The Iron Matron's gaze sharpened, fixed unwaveringly on Lucavian. Her eyes held a kind of quiet challenge, and Lucavian, unfazed, met it head-on, the edges of his mouth curved in a slight, almost daring smile. They held each other's stare, a silent contest of wills unfolding between them. After a long, heavy pause, the Iron Matron's lips curved into a small, approving smile. "If that's what you want, then I'll uphold my promise," she murmured, a glint of something like respect flickering in her eyes. Lucavian's own smile widened, but this time it was genuine, a rare glimpse of sincerity in the usually mocking expression he wore. "Thank you, Miss Little Bear," he replied smoothly, inclining his head slightly in a gesture that was part respect, part cheek. The Iron Matron chuckled, crossing her arms as she stood back. "Only you can still use that name. I know that. Is that so?" she remarked, amusement flashing across her face. Then, with a final approving nod to Valeria, she turned and left them for their meal. Valeria, still reeling from the strange exchange, glanced down at her plate, hoping the food might ground her from the swirl of emotions that Lucavian had stirred in her. Just like that, their night went on. Tomorrow morning, Lucavian stepped into the wide, open corridor leading toward the arena, his footsteps echoing against the stone walls. The tension was tangible, and the silence between the thick walls seemed almost expectant, as if the stones themselves understood the significance of this stage. Now that only 32 contestants remained, each match was a spectacle, with every pair battling in full view of the crowd and the tournament's most esteemed guests. He felt the shift in the air, the weight of hundreds of eyes awaiting him on the other side of the gate. As he approached, He let out a slow, steady breath, drawing on his focus as he felt the mana hum through him, resonant and ready. The clash with Zira from the Cloud Heavens sect had left a lingering satisfaction, and he knew that every word he'd thrown back at her had only deepened their interest and their disdain in him. Exactly as planned, the door to the arena loomed ahead, sunlight spilling through the cracks, casting his shadow long and dark across the floor. With a faint smirk, he rested his hand on the hilt of his estoc, feeling the familiar weight as he pushed open the gate and stepped into the open. The noise hit him immediately. A deafening roar of cheers, gasps, and murmurs, the crowd's anticipation filling the air like a living thing. Lucavian paid it no mind. His eyes were already on the ring ahead, his senses sharp, his focus unbreakable. This was his stage, and he would play his part perfectly. You people, this time I will make sure to crush you thoroughly. Chapter 216, Disgrace. Lucavian stepped fully into the arena, the wave of noise crashing over him. A mixture of cheers, gasps, and the low murmurs of those eagerly anticipating the clash. He was well aware that his fight had drawn attention, perhaps one of the most awaited matchups of this round. The crowd's anticipation was a living thing, buzzing and crackling in the air around him, but his focus remained unwavering. His gaze sharpened as his opponent emerged from the opposite gate. A young woman, draped in the unmistakable blue robes of the Cloud Heavens sect, stepped into the arena with a poised, deliberate grace. Her hair was pulled back tightly, accentuating her sharp, focused expression. A faint aura of chilled blue light surrounded her, hinting at her skill with water or ice-based mana, the preferred elements of her sect. Indeed, for someone to be the one that can advance into the top 32, her strength is indeed not a joke. He mused inwardly, his eyes taking in her disciplined stance and the slight tension in her shoulders. Her face remained impassive, yet her gaze held a glint of determination as she locked eyes with him across the arena, clearly intent on proving herself. The crowd hushed slightly, their whispers tapering off as they recognized the emblems of the Cloud Heavens sect on her robes. Lucavian knew this was no ordinary fight. The sect had likely chosen her specifically, hoping she would be able to neutralize the threat he posed to their reputation. He gave her a faint, knowing smile, one that held both amusement and a hint of challenge. Let's see if she's as capable as they claim. The announcer's voice rang out, calling attention to the match and detailing the competitors. On one side, we have the tournament's rising star, a fighter who has taken Andelheim by storm with his skill and speed. The Phantom Blade, Lucavian. A wave of cheers erupted, the crowd chanting his title, the name already cemented in their minds. Lucavian barely acknowledged the noise, his eyes never leaving his opponent, a faint smirk playing on his lips as he awaited the introduction of his adversary. And on the other side, the announcer continued, his voice swelling with dramatic flair, a prodigy from the renowned Cloud Heavens sect, known for her precision and mastery over the water arts. The glacial bloom, Kara of Ren. The audience gasped and murmured in recognition of her title. Kara of Ren was well known among the sect's disciples, a young fighter who wielded her elemental prowess with elegance and deadly grace that had earned her respect and notoriety. Kara held herself with composed dignity, her eyes meeting Lucavian's with unwavering focus, her hand steady on the hilt of her curved blade. Lucavian's smirk widened as he inclined his head slightly in acknowledgement. So, the glacial bloom, is it? The title seemed fitting. The announcer stepped back, his voice echoing, "Let the match begin." The crowd's cheers intensified, but Lucavian heard none of it, his mind laser-focused on his opponent. This was the moment, one that would test both skill and intent. Kara of Ren's gaze remained steady as she drew her curved blade, her posture poised and collected. A hint of disdain flickered in her eyes as she looked Lucavian over, sizing him up. "When you had the chance," she said calmly, her voice laced with an edge of contempt, "you should have taken it." Lucavian met her gaze, his smirk widening as he held her stare with unwavering confidence. "If you were so confident in your abilities, why did your sect even bother making such an offer?" Kara's lips tightened, her expression cool and unyielding. To show courtesy, of course. But perhaps we should have expected a vulgar man like you to reject something so honorable. Her words dripped with disdain as if his very presence offended her. Lucavian shook his head slowly, a look of amused disbelief crossing his face as he rested his hand on the hilt of his estoc. With a practiced calm, he drew the blade, its length gleaming under the sunlight, and pointed it toward her. "For someone like you to call me vulgar," he murmured, his voice soft but carrying a sharp edge. "You and your sect reek of male influence. Just yesterday you were more focused on whatever, never mind." He let his words hang in the air, his smirk never faltering. "Are you even taking this seriously?" A flicker of anger flashed in her eyes, but Kara kept her expression controlled, her stance tightening as she readied herself. Her grip on the hilt of her sword grew firmer, and a faint aura of chilled blue energy began to gather around her. "Shut your mouth." The words had barely left Kara's lips before she moved, her body a blur of motion. Swoosh! With practiced footwork, she closed the distance between them in an instant, her speed undeniable. Blue mana gathered around her curved blade, a frosty aura that sent a chill through the air. Her sword flashed as she slashed downward, aiming straight for Lucavian. Clank! Lucavian reacted instantly, his estoc rising to meet her attack with a sharp clank. The impact reverberated through his arm, and he noted the intensity of her strike. She was strong, faster than most opponents he had faced in this tournament. The air around them crackled with her icy mana, its chilling energy attempting to seep through his guard. Their gazes met as their blades locked, his smirk meeting her cold, narrowed eyes. "Is that it?" He taunted, his tone light, almost mocking. Kara's expression didn't falter, her grip tightening as her blue aura intensified, ice beginning to creep along her blade, threatening to encase his estoc. She pushed against him, her eyes flashing with determination. "You talk too much for someone who's about to lose," she replied coolly. Lucavian felt the chill seeping toward him, her mana pressing in as she attempted to freeze his weapon. "Lower the grip." He shifted his stance, sliding his blade along hers to break her hold. Clank! With a quick twist of his wrist, he deflected her sword to the side, using her momentum to unbalance her for a brief second. Kara was quick, regaining her footing almost instantly, but Lucavian took advantage of the opening he had created. Quite sloppy, overly reliant on mana, swoosh, he spun, his estoc slicing through the air in a calculated, precise arc aimed at her shoulder. Kara twisted her body, narrowly dodging the strike as she pivoted away, her icy aura flaring around her in response. Creak! She wasn't about to let him gain the upper hand so easily. With a fierce determination, she dashed back toward him, her footwork fluid and refined as she brought her sword down in another powerful slash. Clank! Lucavian met her attack head-on, their swords clashing once more in a shower of sparks and mana. The force of her mana-infused strike was impressive, but Lucavian's technique remained steady and unyielding, his movements controlled and precise as he parried her every attempt. Just why? Why can't I pass through him? He is not even using any mana. The clash continued, with Kara's frustration growing by the second. No matter how much power she poured into her strikes, no matter how refined her footwork, she couldn't seem to break through Lucavian's defenses. The fact that he hadn't even used his mana once gnawed at her pride, filling her with a simmering anger. How is he stopping me without even using mana? She fumed, her mind racing as she fought to understand his impenetrable defense. Refusing to accept this imbalance, she gritted her teeth and resolved to end it with her most powerful technique. She channeled her mana into her sword, the icy aura intensifying as she recalled the teachings of her sect's manual, the Frost Lotus Doctrine. This wasn't just an ordinary technique. It was one of the core moves taught only to the most promising disciples of the Cloud Heavens sect. Her eyes flashed with determination as she prepared the move her master had personally taught her. Lotus Petal Severance. Lucavian's gaze sharpened as he sensed the shift in her stance, noting the surge of mana now enveloping her blade. The temperature around them plummeted, frost creeping across the arena floor as Kara raised her sword, the blade encased in a crystalline blue light that shimmered like ice. H.A. With a cry, she brought down her sword in a powerful, arcing strike, the energy of the lotus petal severance, slicing through the air toward Lucavian, the very force of it cutting through the ground as it approached. Huff! Lucavian released a small breath as he readied himself as well. Such a weak essence. The technique was powerful indeed, something that not every awakened could use. But in the end, if the one wielding it didn't train the technique enough, how could it be enough? Lucavian watched the incoming strike, his eyes narrowing with a mixture of disdain and disappointment. They really are a disgrace, he muttered under his breath. Chapter 217. Kara, 2. Lotus Petal Severance. They really are a disgrace. For all the grand reputation of the Cloud Heavens sect, Kara's execution of such a high-level technique lacked the refinement and precision he'd expected. Power alone wasn't enough. Without control, it was a hollow display. With a fluid movement, he raised his estoc slightly to his right side, assuming a wing stance, his blade poised to intercept. As the ice-infused energy of the lotus petal severance descended, tearing through the ground, he met it head-on. Creak, creak. With a sharp twist of his wrist, he cross-slashed the incoming ice strikes, breaking them apart in midair, the shards of cold mana scattering harmlessly around him. His blade moved like an extension of his intent, slicing through the icy assault with ease. Without hesitation, his arm continued the arc, bringing his estoc to his left side as he stepped forward. In one smooth motion, he brought his blade down diagonally, the strike aimed directly at Kara's sword as she descended. Clang! Their swords clashed with a force that echoed through the arena, but it was Kara who bore the brunt of the impact. Her eyes widened in shock as her carefully cultivated technique was shattered so easily. The sheer strength behind Lucavian's counter forced her back, her body twisting as she lost her balance, thrown off by the unexpected force and the angle of his strike. Before she could recover, Lucavian moved with ruthless efficiency. He didn't even waste a single moment at all. Thud! His left arm, which had been free all the time, snapped forward, his elbow catching her squarely in the face. The impact was brutal, sending her reeling, her momentum completely reversed as she stumbled back, her grip on her sword weakening. Irk! The crowd gasped, stunned by the sudden shift in the fight's tempo. Lucavian remained unfazed, his expression as calm as ever, his gaze fixed on Kara as she struggled to regain her footing. Kara staggered back, her vision swimming as the pain in her face blossomed into a brutal ache. She could feel the sharp, burning sensation from her shattered nose, and instinctively brought a hand up to her face. Her fingers came away wet with blood, her once composed expression twisted in a mixture of agony and fury. The once proud, beautiful image she held had been shattered along with her nose, her face now smeared with blood and a hint of snot from the brutal impact. Her glare was murderous as she fixed her eyes on Lucavian, the humiliation only fueling her anger. You'll pay for this, she spat, her voice muffled and nasally from the injury. Rage boiled within her, her mana swirling in response as she clenched her sword tightly. Despite the pain, she held her stance, but her focus was wavering, her control slipping as she was consumed by her wounded pride. Lucavian simply raised his blade, his expression unreadable, but a faint smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. With a slight tilt of his head, he made a small, taunting gesture with his sword, beckoning her forward. "Come on then," he said, his tone calm, almost bored. "Let's hope that strike just now wasn't your most powerful move. If so, then I believe your sect will always remain a second hand all the time." Kara's face contorted with rage as Lucavian's words sank in, each syllable like salt in an open wound. "You bastard," she snarled, her voice seething with fury. "You're just a man. Nothing more." With a shout, she lunged forward, propelling herself with a burst of mana, her sword arcing toward him with deadly intent. But Lucavian remained utterly calm, his smirk widening as he adjusted his stance. This time, He'd already seen through her fighting style, and he was more than prepared. As Kara's blade came crashing down, Lucavian stepped back just enough for her strike to miss, the edge of her sword grazing the air between them. His estoc, with its extended reach, flicked forward, meeting her sword mid-swing and diverting it harmlessly to the side. Each movement was precise, each step calculated, his footwork flawless as he maintained the perfect distance between them. Kara gritted her teeth, frustration gnawing at her as she realized she couldn't even close the gap between them. She slashed again, this time infusing her strike with a surge of mana, hoping to catch him off guard. But Lucavian adjusted with a swift shift of his stance, his estoc flicking out to deflect her blow, the extra reach of his weapon keeping her at bay effortlessly. Their clash continued, but it was no contest. Lucavian's mastery over spacing was impeccable, his movements fluid as he kept just beyond her reach, his estoc darting in and out like a serpent. Every time she tried to close the distance, his blade would intercept hers, either diverting her attack or forcing her back with a small, calculated counter. Kara's frustration only grew, her strikes becoming more erratic as she realized she couldn't touch him. Even with her mana-infused attacks, he remained untouchable, his blade finding its mark with perfect timing and precision. He controlled the space between them with an ease that bordered on insulting, as if he were toying with her. "You call that an attack?" he asked, his voice laced with mocking amusement. "If this is all the Cloud Heaven sect has to offer, maybe you should start spending more time on the training grounds, rather than with men at night, don't you think?" "Shut up. Why? Does the truth hurt? Shut up. Or will you just cry for attention again? Tears won't save you here, though be careful. Shut up." The crowd watched in stunned silence as Kara's attempts became increasingly erratic, her focus fractured by the continuous, stinging insults. And finally, as she gathered her mana for one final strike, Lucavian sighed, shifting his gaze to the audience with a look of utter boredom. "This is utterly pathetic, isn't it?" With a quick, effortless motion, he sidestepped her final strike, and before she could realize her mistake, his estoc shot forward. The blade pierced her right shoulder, the arm she'd been using to attack, stopping her assault in its tracks. Kara's eyes widened in pain and shock as she felt the cold steel drive into her flesh, her blade falling short yet again, out of reach. Lucavian withdrew his estoc with a swift motion, leaving her reeling, clutching her wounded shoulder. He then raised his blade and placed the tip against her neck, his eyes unyielding and his expression calm. "Yield," he said softly, his voice carrying a finality that left no room for argument. Kara stood frozen, her breathing ragged, her pride shattered. Her hand trembled as she looked up at him, the reality of her defeat settling in with brutal clarity. "I said yield." Kara's gaze faltered as she looked up at him, the weight of her defeat pressing down on her like a physical force. Her breathing was shallow, her pride in tatters, and as the tip of Lucavian's estoc remained poised at her neck, her resolve finally crumbled. "I yield," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but enough for him and the referee to hear. Her hand clutched her wounded shoulder, while her other hand cupped her head in disbelief, the pain mingling with the shock of just how thoroughly she'd been bested. As she looked at him, the icy calm in his pitch-black gaze and the unwavering precision of his movements, a shiver ran through her. Who said this guy was a phantom blade? She thought bitterly, her mind reeling. This guy, he's a demon. The crowd erupted in a mixture of shock and applause, but Lucavian remained composed, lowering his estoc and giving her a slight nod as he stepped back, allowing her a moment of dignity even in defeat. Kara's face flushed with a mix of shame and awe as she staggered back, unable to shake the realization that she'd faced something far more formidable than she'd expected. Lucavian turned, his gaze sweeping over the audience, his expression calm yet unreadable, leaving the spectators in awe of his unflinching prowess and mastery. He had proven himself without a trace of hesitation, a fighter who commanded respect through his actions alone. In the private lounge, where Marquis Venter and the two sect elders watched the battles unfold, an uncomfortable silence filled the air following the conclusion of Lucavian and Kara's fight. The tension was palpable as the echoes of the crowd's shock and applause resonated through the arena. Marquis Venter's face remained neutral, though his eyes gleamed with an undeniable intrigue at the display of skill he had just witnessed. Then, a sudden, sharp sound broke the silence. Crack, a crack. Both the Marquis and Elder Kale turned their attention toward the source of the sound. Elder Shue's hand was clenched around the armrest of her chair, her fingers digging in with enough force that the finely crafted wood had splintered beneath her grip. Her face was a mask of controlled fury. Her eyes narrowed as she watched the arena, her gaze locked onto Lucavian's figure. Chapter 218. Kara, 3. Crack, a crack. Both the Marquis and Elder Kale turned their attention toward the source of the sound. Elder Shue's hand was clenched around the armrest of her chair, her fingers digging in with enough force that the finely crafted wood had splintered beneath her grip. Her face was a mask of controlled fury. Her eyes narrowed as she watched the arena, her gaze locked onto Lucavian's figure. Elder Kale's mouth curled into a smug smile, relishing the sight of his rival's frustration. "Troubling, isn't it?" he drawled, his voice laced with barely concealed satisfaction. "It appears that your so-called glacial bloom wilted in the face of a true flame." Elder Shue's gaze remained fixed on the arena, though the chill in her eyes spoke volumes. "One fight means nothing," she replied icily, her voice low and controlled, though a tremor of anger simmered beneath her words. "Skill cannot be measured by a single bout." Kale's smile widened, his tone dripping with mock sympathy. "Ah, but this was more than just a single bout, wouldn't you agree? To lose so thoroughly, to be outmatched so easily. One might even question the quality of her training." Marquis Venter raised a hand, his gaze thoughtful as he intervened smoothly. "Indeed, the young man displayed remarkable control and precision. Yet every fight is but one stepping stone on a much larger path." His tone was neutral, aimed at diffusing the mounting tension, though the faint gleam in his eyes betrayed his amusement. Elder Shue's grip on the armrest loosened slightly, though her posture remained rigid, her pride still stinging from the public defeat of her sect's disciple. "This is far from over," she murmured, her tone carrying a hint of threat. "The Cloud Heaven's sect does not yield so easily." Kale leaned back, folding his arms with a smug air of satisfaction. "We'll see if there's anything left to yield once the tournament progresses. Fire, after all, only grows stronger when fed with false pride." As the elders exchanged their veiled barbs, Marquis Venter turned his gaze back to the arena, where Lucavian stood tall amidst the crowd's awe and whispers. This fight had only deepened the intrigue surrounding him, and the Marquis knew well that this young fighter's path would no longer be easy. But the question was, is he worth offending the Cloud Heaven's sect? His mind's gears were working. Valeria had quietly settled into her spot within the fighter's lounge, a designated space away from the raucous crowds, reserved only for the remaining competitors. With the tournament dwindling down to its final rounds, this area provided an intimate and direct view of the arena, allowing the fighters to observe each other's abilities firsthand. From her seat, Valeria could see Lucavian step confidently into the arena, a slight, familiar smirk playing on his face as he faced Kara of Ren. "This guy, now, I am starting to understand him. I feel like..." She noted the way he held himself, that relaxed arrogance tempered with unwavering control. His demeanor contrasted sharply with Kara's disciplined intensity, her every motion honed and purposeful as she prepared her stance. "But regardless, this girl is strong." The faint blue aura surrounding her blade, a signature of the Cloud Heaven's sex techniques, caught Valeria's eye, reminding her of the raw but refined mana Kara possessed. Valeria observed closely, her expression unreadable, though internally she was dissecting each movement, each clash of blades. She had witnessed Lucavian's ruthless efficiency before, but seeing it from this distance and angle, the fluidity of his strikes and the absolute precision with which he maneuvered began to sink in anew. It was clear he wasn't here merely to compete. He was here to dominate, perhaps to make a statement that extended far beyond a mere tournament victory. As Kara's attacks intensified, Valeria could see her frustration mounting. No matter how elegantly Kara wielded her mana or the techniques from her sect, Lucavian's unyielding defense met each strike with unbothered ease, almost mocking in its efficiency. This scene stirred something in Valeria. She felt a mix of admiration and intrigue, mingling with a quiet sense of unease. Lucavian's control over spacing and distance, paired with his taunting remarks, had completely unraveled Kara, who had now forsaken her earlier grace for desperate attacks. When Lucavian countered Kara's strongest technique, breaking apart her icy lotus petal severance with nothing more than a practiced flick of his estoc, Valeria's eyes narrowed, studying the finesse in his technique. This is why I lost at that time, she mused, her jaw tightening slightly. Lucavian hadn't even needed to rely on mana, relying instead on pure technique, a mastery so complete that it left little room for his opponents to respond. It was like he was on another plane of swordsmanship, wielding his blade with a refined skill she had yet to fully grasp. "Wow," she whispered under her breath, still processing the scene that had just unfolded. A sharp, guttural noise broke through her thoughts. The tense sound of clenched fists, the quiet rage simmering in the air, pulled her back to the present. She turned her head slightly and noticed a small group of disciples from the Cloud Heavens sect. Their eyes narrowed with barely concealed hatred as they stared at Lucavian's distant figure. Murmurs of anger and quiet, venom-laden threats slipped from between their gritted teeth. "Arrogant bastard," one of them spat, her voice low and trembling with barely suppressed rage. "He'll pay for this. Mark my words. He doesn't know who he's messing with." "The Cloud Heavens sect won't stand for this," muttered another, her gaze dark with resentment. Valeria watched them quietly, recognizing the frustration and wounded pride in their eyes. Lucavian had humiliated Kara, not just defeated her, but broken through her strongest moves with such ease that it almost seemed disrespectful. And Kara, the once composed glacial bloom, had been forced to yield in front of the entire crowd, her pride and reputation in tatters. But even as she absorbed the disciples' anger, Valeria felt a cold clarity settle over her own thoughts. At the end of the day, she reasoned, this only happened because Kara was too weak to withstand him. The raw truth of that thought surprised even herself, but it felt solid, undeniable. If she couldn't hold her ground, if she let herself fall into his traps and lose control, that's on her. In this tournament, weakness had no place. Watching Lucavian's display had only reinforced that for her. If Kara had truly been prepared, she wouldn't have succumbed so easily to her anger, nor would she have made mistakes that exposed her vulnerabilities. No, regardless of what she did, her level was simply not enough. Valeria's thoughts drifted back to Kara's movements, replaying each of her swings, the flow of her mana, and the stance she'd held at the beginning of the fight. The power of Kara's mana had been undeniable, a potent force that filled the arena with a bone-chilling aura. It was the kind of raw strength that only high-level cultivation could provide. But beneath that icy energy, something was missing, a cohesion, a true foundation to support the power she wielded. Her cultivation level must be advanced, Valeria mused, recalling the concentrated aura that had encased Kara's blade, a chilling blue light dense enough to almost freeze the air. But what good is that power if her technique can't back it up? Kara's strikes had been filled with force, but her stance and movements had been slightly misaligned, lacking the stability and focus needed to wield that kind of strength effectively. Valeria had noticed it right from the start. Kara's form wavered when she channeled too much mana, her movements becoming erratic and less precise. It was a flaw Lucavian had picked up on immediately, and he'd exploited it, letting her own strength become a liability. If she had the foundation, if her stance was even a fraction steadier, Valeria trailed off, her gaze sharpening. As a knight, she had trained rigorously in the basics. Stances drilled until her feet ached, blade angles adjusted until every move was instinct. Her own family had insisted on perfection, telling her time and again that without solid basics, strength meant nothing. Kara's performance had shown her just how true that was. But is this really the extent of Cloud Heaven's sect? Why is there such a disparity? That was the question that was on everyone's mind right now. One of the strongest disciples of the entire sect, lost in such a pathetic manner? Could this really happen for a sect that was rumored to be filled with talents and could rival the Silver Flame sect? For those in the path of awakening, the process wasn't just about power. It required balance. Strength alone wasn't enough. Awakened fighters often had to first stabilize their cultivation after each breakthrough, refining their cores and learning to wield their enhanced mana without becoming reckless. This stabilization phase, where they became accustomed to the advanced intricacies of their techniques, was just as crucial as reaching a new level. So why didn't she show any sign of that stability? Valeria mused, the question settling heavily in her mind. It wasn't uncommon for sect disciples to divide their training between combat technique and cultivation. This practice provided not only stability but also a deep understanding of their power's limits and applications, preventing their strength from becoming a liability. Among the stronger sects, this integration of combat and cultivation was finely tuned, each phase meticulously optimized. She glanced toward the seating area of the Silver Flame sect, noting their composed expressions and steady demeanors as they observed the scene without a trace of surprise or frustration. Rather, they looked pleased, and it was understandable. Their enemy got a swift tent in their reputation after all. Creak. Just then, the door opened, and Lucavian entered. Chapter 219 He. As the door swung open, a quiet tension fell over the room. Every head turned as Lucavian strode into the lounge, his presence immediately drawing attention. His expression was as composed as ever, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his lips as if he were perfectly aware of the storm his victory had stirred. Valeria's gaze sharpened as she watched him, noting the relaxed, almost casual air with which he carried himself. He had just humiliated a top disciple of the Cloud Heavens sect, a fact that didn't seem to weigh on him in the slightest. But his entry hadn't gone unnoticed. Across the room, the Cloud Heavens sect disciples glared at him, their faces dark with hostility. "You! How dare you show your face?" Two of the disciples stood abruptly, their hands twitching toward their weapons, their expressions murderous. They looked as if they would gladly challenge him here and now, regardless of the consequences. Hop! 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 Stay there. But before they could make a move, a ripple of motion swept through the opposite side of the room. The Silver Flame sect disciples rose to their feet as well, their gazes coolly fixed on the Cloud Heavens sect members. Though they had no particular allegiance to Lucavian, the principle was clear enough. The enemy of my enemy is my ally. This was an opportunity for the Silver Flame sect to make their stance known, to ensure that the Cloud Heavens sect wouldn't act rashly in their pursuit of retribution. The tension was thick, unspoken threats hanging in the air as the two groups faced each other. Lucavian's smirk only grew as he observed the scene, his dark eyes flickering with amusement as he took in the obvious animosity. He didn't appear remotely threatened, almost as if he found the entire display beneath him. They acted immediately. Valeria, still seated, felt the ripple of tension and glanced between the two factions. She had expected the Cloud Heavens sect disciples to be livid, but the immediate response from the Silver Flame sect caught her off guard. Their cold confidence underscored the power dynamics between these sects, a readiness to undercut their rivals at the slightest opportunity. They weren't supporting Lucavian directly, but their message was clear enough. They would not allow the Cloud Heavens sect to disrupt the arena's order. The Cloud Heavens sect disciples, their faces twisted in anger, shot deadly glares toward the Silver Flame sect disciples, their resentment almost palpable. The tension in the room spiked as one of the girls, her eyes blazing with indignation, hissed through gritted teeth, "This has nothing to do with you, so stay out of it." But the Silver Flame sect disciples didn't budge, their expressions calm but their eyes glinting with a competitive edge. One of the boys crossed his arms, a slight smirk tugging at his lips as he met the girl's glare head-on. "Why not?" he asked, his tone cool and laced with amusement. "If you have a problem with the outcome, why don't we handle it here? Or would that be inconvenient for you?" The Cloud Heavens sect girls bristled, their hands tightening on the hilts of their weapons. One of them took a step forward, her voice laced with venom. "You think you're so clever, don't you? Always meddling in matters that don't concern you. Just because you think you're stronger doesn't mean you have the right to interfere. Another Silver Flame sect disciple laughed. A short, mocking sound. Ah, so you admit it then, he said, his tone taunting. You're weaker, so we don't have the right to stand here, is that it? His gaze turned toward Lucavian, a faint grin of appreciation tugging at his lips. Seems to me he just gave one of your strongest a lesson in humility. But if you're so confident, we're ready whenever you are. Stop. Eventually, the girls were stopped by their senior disciple, Lyra. Her calm voice echoed around the room, her eyes locked on the girls. Let's not cause a scene here and lower ourselves. But I said enough. Reluctantly, the girls exchanged glances before stepping back, releasing their grips on their weapons and returning to their seats. Though each movement was tense with barely contained anger, the room's atmosphere gradually settled, the Silver Flame sect disciples still watching with thinly veiled amusement as the Cloud Heavens sect girls glowered in silence. With the immediate threat diffused, Lucavian took advantage of the lull and began walking over to where Valeria sat, his easy stride unfazed by the commotion he'd left in his wake. He reached her table and, without a word, pulled out the chair beside her and sat down, a faint smirk still playing at the corners of his lips. Valeria glanced at him, arching an eyebrow. His composure was as irritating as it was impressive. "Enjoyed yourself?" she murmured, her voice low enough not to attract attention, though the slight edge in her tone suggested she wasn't entirely pleased with the scene he'd caused. "Oh, immensely," Lucavian replied smoothly, leaning back in his chair with an air of satisfaction. His gaze flicked toward the Cloud Heavens sect disciples, who were still throwing daggers in his direction with their eyes before he shrugged with mock innocence. They seemed eager for a lesson. "I was just accommodating them." Valeria held back a sigh, watching him for a moment before looking away. "You're courting trouble with them. Do you have any idea how much they'll be watching you now?" Lucavian raised an eyebrow, leaning in just slightly as he fixed Valeria with a curious look. "Why should I worry?" he asked, his tone casual, as if they were discussing the weather rather than the very real threat of an entire sect's wrath. Valeria stared at him, trying to process the sheer audacity of his question. She opened her mouth, then paused, momentarily thrown off by the calm confidence in his eyes. "Aren't you?" She gestured vaguely as if searching for a way to make him see the obvious. "Aren't you alone here? How can you possibly expect to go up against an entire sect by yourself?" But Lucavian merely shrugged, the smirk never leaving his face. "Who said I'd be doing anything alone?" he replied smoothly, his voice laced with a quiet, unshakable confidence. He leaned back, folding his arms with an easy nonchalance that bordered on arrogance. "Besides, they're not nearly as dangerous as they think they are." Valeria couldn't help but feel a flicker of disbelief. His confidence seemed absurd, reckless even. But looking at him now, utterly calm in the face of such odds, she found herself wondering if perhaps there was more to his certainty than sheer bravado. He seemed entirely unfazed, as though he'd already considered every possible outcome and knew he'd come out ahead regardless. Finally, she shook her head, sighing as she gave him a sidelong glance. "Whatever," she muttered, a hint of resignation in her tone. "If you're so determined to bring a storm down on yourself, don't say I didn't warn you." Lucavian chuckled softly, his eyes glinting with amusement as he watched her. "Ah, is Lady Valeria worried about me? This may be one of the happiest days of my life." "You? Who is worried about you?" "I just pointed out the obvious." Valeria's jaw clenched as she looked away, trying to ignore the infuriating grin Lucavian wore like a badge of honor. "This bastard is relentless with his teasing," she thought, fighting the urge to respond with something sharp. But Lucavian was far from finished. He leaned in just a little, his voice dropping to an almost conspiratorial whisper. "So quick to deny it," he murmured with a faint, knowing smirk. "You know, for someone who just pointed out the obvious, you sounded rather concerned." Valeria turned sharply, her eyes narrowing. "I don't waste concern on people who don't know how to stay out of trouble." She crossed her arms, willing her expression to remain cool and indifferent, but the faintest flush betrayed her irritation. Lucavian hummed, clearly entertained, his eyes dancing with a mischievous glint as he leaned back in his chair, thoroughly pleased with himself. "TCH," Valeria scoffed, turning her gaze away from him and pretending to fix her attention on the arena. She could feel him smirking beside her, basking in the satisfaction of her reaction. "He's impossible," she thought, annoyed at how easily he managed to get under her skin. Just then, a loud chime rang through the lounge, silencing the murmurs and drawing everyone's attention. The arena doors swung open, and the remaining contestants began making their way to the center stage. The buzz of anticipation filled the room as spectators leaned forward, eager to see who would take the next matches. Anyway, and then one of the favorite times of her week came, talking about swords while watching the fights. Regardless of what kind of guy Lucavian was, there was one thing that Valeria was forced to acknowledge. When it came to swords, his insights and comments were just better. "What do you think about these guys?" Chapter 220. The Beastkin. "Anyway," Valeria said, attempting to steer the conversation back to something less aggravating. She turned her gaze toward the contestants in the arena, her voice carrying an edge of formality as she nodded toward the fighters below. "What do you think about these guys?" Lucavian's smirk softened into something more thoughtful as he followed her gaze. Over the past few weeks, watching the matches together had become an unexpected ritual, one that Valeria found herself looking forward to more than she'd anticipated. Despite his infuriating personality, Lucavian had a unique way of seeing through each fighter's technique, breaking down their flaws and strengths with a precision that was almost surgical. And for someone like Valeria, who valued skill and discipline above all else, his insights were strangely compelling. Lucavian murmured, his eyes narrowing as he analyzed the contestants taking their stances. "See the one on the right? He's too stiff. Look at his shoulders. He's forcing the stance instead of letting it flow. He'll lose power in his strikes, and he'll tire faster than he realizes." Valeria nodded, catching the subtle tension in the fighter's posture. "And his footwork," she added, leaning in slightly as she examined his stance. "It's too flat. He'll struggle to adjust if his opponent shifts the angle. A single feint could throw him off." Lucavian's smile turned appreciative, a quiet spark of approval in his eyes. "Exactly. He's relying on power alone, which only works until someone catches onto the pattern." He paused, his gaze drifting to the second fighter, who seemed lighter on his feet, his stance more fluid. "Now that one, he's got better balance, but he's holding his blade too loosely. He's fast, but he won't be able to control his strikes if he tries to overpower." Valeria's eyes followed his line of sight, and she felt a small thrill at the clarity in his observations. If he had even a fraction more control, he could turn his speed into a real advantage. She glanced over at Lucavian. "Would you be able to do it?" Lucavian chuckled, his gaze remaining on the fight as it began. "Guess." And as the two fighters clashed, Valeria leaned in, her focus sharpening. She and Lucavian fell into their usual rhythm, exchanging observations and critiques as the match played out before them. It was during these moments, discussing the intricate details of each technique and debating improvements, that she felt most at ease, her usual wariness melting away as she immersed herself in the conversation. It was ironic, really. Despite Lucavian's insufferable teasing, it was in these discussions that she found herself genuinely enjoying his company. Here, beneath the arena's lights and amidst the clashing steel, they spoke a language only the two of them seemed to understand, a shared passion for the sword that transcended their differences. With each insight, Lucavian's voice lost its usual mocking edge, replaced by an intensity that almost mirrored her own. In these rare moments, Valeria felt an unspoken connection, a camaraderie forged not through words, but through the unyielding pursuit of mastery. She couldn't help but feel a flicker of excitement every time he pointed out something she'd missed or added a layer of insight she hadn't considered. For Valeria, this was the best part of her week. Asterisk. Just like that, some more matches went down, and it was time for Valeria's match. As Valeria stood up, readying herself to head down to the arena, A wave of nervous anticipation rolled through her. She tried to steady her breathing, her fingers unconsciously brushing the hilt of her sword for reassurance. Her opponent this time was different from anyone she'd faced so far. A young beastkin boy whose strength was an enigma. She had watched him fight before, but something about his movements made it hard for her to gauge his abilities. Each of his matches had ended quickly, with a fluidity and ease that left little indication of his true limits. Lucavian's gaze drifted toward her, a hint of curiosity in his eyes as he took in her expression. "A little nervous, are we?" he asked, his tone somewhere between teasing and genuinely observant. Valeria shot him a look, half annoyed and half grateful for the distraction. "I'm not nervous," she said, though the tightness in her voice betrayed her. "I just can't quite read him yet." Lucavian chuckled softly, leaning back in his chair as he regarded her with that all-too-familiar smirk. "That's because it is the first time you are encountering a beastkin fighting? Isn't that right?" Valeria nodded, her gaze distant as she recalled the beastkin boy's previous fights. "Yes, it's the first time," she admitted, a flicker of hesitation in her voice. "But it's not just that." She glanced back toward the arena, where her opponent had fought. "As you said, beastkin fight differently," she continued, thinking aloud as she tried to piece together her unease. "But this one, it's not just the speed or strength. There's something urgent about their movements, like he's fighting with a certain desperation." Lucavian's smirk softened, a glint of understanding in his eyes as he nodded for her to continue. It was rare for her to admit feeling unsettled, and he seemed to recognize that there was more behind her words than mere nerves. "He looks young, but it's like he's willing to risk injury, as though holding back isn't even an option for him," she said, frowning slightly. "It's strange to fight someone who fights with that level of abandon. Feels wrong." She couldn't quite explain the feeling, but something about her opponent's fighting style unsettled her. The way he moved was like someone who had learned to push past pain, almost as if he were used to treating every battle as a life-or-death encounter. Lucavian's gaze sharpened, his tone quiet but thoughtful. "You are indeed sharp." Lucavian didn't elaborate further, his expression unreadable as he leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Regardless of whatever it is," he said finally, his tone firm yet calm, "just go out there and prove what you need to." "That's it." Valeria met his gaze, feeling a faint prickle of suspicion at his words. The way he'd spoken, so careless, yet with an underlying familiarity, made her wonder if he knew something about the beastkin boy. But Lucavian offered no further insight, and his expression remained closed, leaving her with only more questions. Deciding not to press him, she pushed her unease aside, reminding herself to stay focused. Taking a deep breath, she nodded, more to herself than to Lucavian. She turned away, making her way down toward the staging area where her armor awaited. As she walked, she could still feel the weight of Lucavian's gaze on her, his unspoken words echoing in her mind. Once in the preparation area, Valeria methodically strapped on her armor, feeling the familiar weight settle over her shoulders. The metallic clink of each piece, the well-worn leather of her gloves, all of it helped steady her nerves. She adjusted the hilt of her sword, feeling the cool metal beneath her fingers, grounding her. Whatever mysteries surrounded her opponent, she knew her own purpose here: to test her skill, to refine her strength, to prove her own path. "Valeria! Valerian! Valeria! Valerian! Valeria! Go, Lady Knight! Get them!" Stepping out into the arena, the roar of the crowd washed over her. The air felt thick with anticipation as her boots hit the sand, the weight of her armor grounding her in the moment. She looked at the lounge, and there, saw him observing the field. And well, it did take a small effect. Across from her, the beastkin boy stood waiting, his posture loose and unguarded, but his eyes sharp, studying her with the same intensity she'd come to expect from him. Yeah, regardless of what it is, Valeria took her stance, her fingers flexing around the hilt of her sword. She felt the familiar surge of adrenaline, the steady beat of her pulse in her ears. Her gaze met his, unyielding, and she could see that same fierce determination mirrored back at her. A really fierce gaze. It was weird for someone this young to have such a gaze. I wonder what happened. She was curious. Ladies and gentlemen, but when the announcer's voice echoed through the arena, signaling the beginning of the match, Valeria steeled herself, her focus narrowing to the figure in front of her. Young or not, this person managed to pave his way through the tournament. They must be strong. That is why she would not underestimate him. This was her moment, and whatever unknowns lay between them, she would face him head-on. On the other hand, as the fight was about to start, Lucavian's gaze was focused on a certain young boy. Found you. It was one of the people that he wanted to come to know about. Vitali Era. He called to Vitali Era in his head. Today, he was going to prevent the fate of some people from going down.
Hello everyone. We now have a Discord server. Join us for faster updates, discussions about your favorite novels, and exclusive Discord-only content. Don't miss out. See you there. Scan the QR code on the screen or enter any of the displayed links into your browser to join our Discord.